Good evening, good afternoon, good whatever it is where you are. Welcome to Coffee and Klausvitz episode Can't Remember. Welcome to the first episode of a new series on great generals. Is that what we're doing?
Yeah.
Yeah. I couldn't remember. All right. It was going to be about baking, but now we're going to do
we're going to
do great
sewing machine. Yeah.
So we thought we'd kick off with the big dog. Well, that's not entirely true. We're going to do a few episodes on this epoch of Napoleon. However, you are going to be cheated this half hour because we're barely going to talk about him.
Oh, naughty!
I know. But seriously, we're not really going to talk about him. What I will be doing is with kind of our usual breakdown of or division of labor, rather. I will be talking about some military, institutional, and a couple of social developments and economic developments prior to the French Revolution in 1789, and I will relate those back to how they're relevant for the French Revolutionary Wars, which start in 1792 and end in 1802. That's right, isn't it? Yeah, that's right. And Mr. Barnstable, can you give us a quick shot across the bowels of what you'll be doing?
Of course, yeah. So I'll be focusing more on the sort of the tactical innovations that happen or are beginning to happen in European land warfare during the French Revolutionary Wars. So I'll be looking at one of Napoleon's battles, which features sort of the beginnings of his tactical system, which goes on to dominate the European battlefield for the next 20 years. But I will also, I've thrown in something a little bit different, a little bit kinky. I will also be looking at
below the water. We are before the watershed, Barney.
Oh, yeah, good point.
Yeah.
All right, never mind.
If we really want to pursue this, I don't think goats need
down, Pedro.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I will also be sort of giving a counterpoint in that we've talked before about how military innovations don't always succeed against what used to work. So I'll be looking at a general, I won't name him yet. I'll be looking at a general who used very old-fashioned military tactics, even at the time, and he had 100% success record.
How many did he only fight one battle? Because that's cheating.
No, he fought 63.
Okay, he can have that. Fair. Good effort.
Yeah. So we'll save that till the end.
Okay. Well, without further ado, off we go.
Yeah.
I think I want to start off by spoiling the idea not spoiling the idea, but at least beginning to challenge the idea that the French Revolution, certainly in military terms, and the tactics employed, was altogether revolutionary. Because when we look back at certainly the latter half of the 18th century, I don't want to talk too much about tactics because that will be treading on your toes, but
in fairness, it will set it up quite nicely if you're explaining how it normally is, because I'm looking at Napoleon's innovations.
It will, and I've just remembered some stuff that I want to say that will set you up like a champ.
All right, go for it.
All over this like a tramp on chips, Barnstable.
Oh yeah.
What's important to remember is that 18th century, by the final decade-ish of the 18th century, Europe has been at war a lot in the previous 40 or 50 years. So let's just begin we have the 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763. Thank you, Bonnie.
It's all right.
we have the American War of Independence, which is quite relevant to us here because the outlay that France lays out, even in its successful intervention, goes a blooming long way toward bankrupting the French crown, instigating tax hikes, which become a major grievance of everybody that doesn't own a yacht or a large house in France, which then feeds into the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Population growth across population and demographic growth across Europe are pretty explosive in the final half of the 18th century. For instance, England in 1751 has a population of about 5.8 million, just under.
5.8 million.
Yeah, I know. So we've got basically half of it in Greater London across the whole of England. By 1801, it's 8.66 million, and we're growing. Not the English population is growing by 11.94% per decade. In the 1750s, it grew by 3.5% per decade.
That's a huge jump.
Yeah, it's enormous. Governments that aren't.
And was that entirely immigration, Harry?
No, it was no. There was agricultural developments and stuffs. Didn't read that. Didn't read that far in the book.
Okay.
But we'll bring it back to purely warfare. As I said, Europe's been at war a lot in the final half of the 18th century. This gives a lot of opportunities and occasions for generals, monarchs, parliaments, the increasingly bureaucratized institutions that we've discussed in previous episodes, to test what they thought worked and reform what didn't work. It's a bit of a misnomer that 18th century theorists and generals are obsessed by fortifications and stayed away from battles all the time. Particularly
certainly by the second half of the century.
Absolutely, and especially when people are losing wars, it's a good opportunity, or it certainly promotes a climate of innovation and revision of what's gone before. Happily for us here, nowhere is this more true than in France. For instance, thinkers like Hippolyte de Guibert, in his Essai général de tactique, General Tactical Essays, published in Paris, 1772.
Ooh.
Now, I want everybody to bear in mind the key points of Guibert. I'm so sorry to any French listeners if that's not right, if I'm butchering his name. But I want you to bear in mind some of his key points that he advocated. He emphasized movement and envelopment and armies to live off the land to speed up operations in order to avoid long baggage trains, commissaries, supply networks. This will become fairly relevant when we get to 1792, 1793, when hitherto unprecedentedly large French armies begin sweeping into Belgium and the Western Rhinelands.
So just to make it clear, I mean, I suppose you can work it out by inference, but living off the land is,
you literally park your army on somebody else's territory and you take everything, and then you move on. This absolutely isn't unknown as a way of supporting an army by the 18th century. It's been happening. We think we discussed it when we talked about the 30 Years' War with volunteers, a system of contributions, and basically that no one could fight across certain areas of Westphalia anymore because it had just been eaten to death.
Yeah.
But Guibert is also a big fan of the flying column. which will also become very relevant later on. Napoleon reads Guibert. We know Napoleon read Guibert and was a big fan of his doctrines. He's also one of the earliest proponents of the idea of the division, which is in this period a unit of soldiers incorporating an all arms composition. So we have infantry, horse, and artillery, whereas in most armies, at most of the time, at this time, these units are separate. They fight together. But the French work out that it's far more effective to have them moving in either smaller groups or together in order to move in and around enemy columns, or enemy armies.
So jumping ahead a little bit, that's what Napoleon calls the corps d'armée.
Absolutely, it's exactly the same concept. And Napoleon piggybacks off institutional frameworks that were already in place before the French Revolution. Like we just mentioned, the division. The French army is organized and administered along these lines by certainly by the late 1780s.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yeah. That it's not the French Revolution doesn't just happen, and all these generals like Ney and Soult, Napoleon and Napoleon Bonaparte rock up and think, oh, we'll start doing everything this way. A lot of these systems and ways of thinking about warfare and using your entire army all at once and moving it together all at once in integrated units had begun 40, 50 years before. The concept of the division turns up in French military literature in 1759.
Oh wow!
It was
before Napoleon's even born.
Yes, indeed. It was news to me too, Barnstable. I was bowled over.
Wow!
Bowled over.
Indeed, yes.
Our second thinker of note is Maurice Count de Saxe, or Marshal Saxe, as he's known. S-A-X-E.
Inventor of the phone.
Absolutely. It's something he doesn't get enough credit for.
Absolutely.
Now he's around he lives between 1696 and 1750, and he writes a book called that actually criticizes only using firepower in a linear way in and of itself. So
linear, you're talking about the standard two lines opposite each other,
two or three lines, even a volley, even firing volleys, which is very fashionable which is very well developed and very fashionable by the early mid 18th century. Volleys, by the way, is where if you imagine three lines of soldiers stood in front, all stood in front of each other. The first line fires, then the second line fires all at once, thereby maximizing the firepower of the group of soldiers. Bear in mind, at this point, everybody's firing flintlock muskets, which have an effective range of about 80 to 100 yards. And if you were lucky, I know you can't. I know you can't see Barney's face, but he just grimaced at
it's just, there are examples of, for example, in the 7 Years' War, the Battle of Rossbach between the Prussians and the French, I think it is, and there's a firefight that goes on for about half an hour. It's over very quickly as a battle, but the Prussians only lose about 500 men. So you can't imagine that the muskets are terrifically accurate.
No, I mean
this time period,
absolutely,
even within that range.
And they were well aware of this. This is why they thought, right, better to get everybody to fire all at once, and chance it and chances a few hits. Saxe isn't a fan of this. He thinks it should be combined with basically his methodology is a 1, 2, maybe 3 volleys, and then you charge in with bayonets. Both Saxe and Guibert emphasized the importance of stout, patriotic citizen armies, men that are invested in the idea of, that are invested in the cause in which they're fighting. This is on its own. Bear in mind, Louis XVI is on the throne, is on the throne still when Guibert is writing, certainly.
Is Saxe also French?
French, yeah, they're both French.
Right.
They're French. So yeah, the idea of incorporating popular soldierly opinion into your battle doctrine is quite a big step forward, because Maurice Count de Saxe, in case you can't tell, was from somewhat of an aristocratic background, but he worked out that if you could get men to be invested in what they were fighting in, they would probably fight better.
I wonder if it's as much a step forward as it is a step back. I'm just thinking a lot of these, certainly the aristocrats, they're going to be very classically trained, aren't they? And well versed in Latin and Greek.
Yeah.
And I wonder how much they're getting this from something like Caesar and his appeal to the
He's a big fan of the Getius. We know Saxe read Roman texts.
Yeah.
But I mean, certainly by the latter half of the 18th century, we're slap bang in the middle of the Enlightenment. In fact, it's been argued that so a lot of the how to phrase it, the testing and retesting and development of things that didn't work, to try and rationally work out the best way of doing X, Y, or Z, was driven by the ideas of the Enlightenment. It's pure rationalism, and yeah. An aristocrat, take aristocrat X in 1780, say. They were all, a lot of people were reading Rousseau and Voltaire. It didn't just being an aristocrat or a notable didn't preclude. We know certainly didn't preclude people from certainly getting hold of these ideas, or even being a fan of them.
Well, de Sade was a marquis after all.
Absolutely. So back to just with Saxe, who's actually he's the first half of the 18th century, and everybody needs to be involved. We need to get the whole army on board, because how are we going to get them to charge at a group of armed men with bayonets and follow through if everybody isn't really up for it? These are all ideas that are taken and ran with by the time of the French Revolution. So we fast forward. We have at least a seedbed of ideas of an institutional development within French military thinking by 1789. Yeah, we get the terror, and they go and chop all the heads off people, like not anyone that sounds vaguely aristocratic, but etc. etc. That's not what we need to talk about right now. What we do need to talk about is that in 1792, damn it, never mind. 1792, French Revolution. Large columns of French troops begin moving into Belgium and the Western Rhineland. Essentially, an edict comes out in the summer of 1792, which promises French help for anyone trying to overthrow a regime such as a regime or an ancien regime, an aristocracy, or an absolute monarchy, such as the Habsburgs,
which is the rest of Europe at
which
this
is
point,
everybody,
apart from Switzerland,
apart from Switzerland, and to an extent England, where we've got public opinion does count for something. I mean, the British establishment does spin this rather well with the British public, and the French are cast as a nation of bloodthirsty regicides, etc. And it works also to an extent in Spain as well, like that with they weren't a fan of chopping the heads off chopping the heads off kings or deposing monarchs. Obviously,
Oh, I thought you were saying the other way around. Yes, right, I'm with you. Yeah.
So the public opinion does matter, but yeah, broadly speaking, this is basically the rest of Europe. Certainly Russia, certainly Austria, certainly Prussia. Even though they might have. No, Russia doesn't have any. We're a long way off the Duma, aren't we?
Oh,
Duma. We're Paul. I mean, Paul the First is on. Is it Paul the First or Paul the Second's on the throne? The one that dies in 1798.
yeah, he briefly comes into what I'm going to talk about. I think it might even be Anne at the start.
I can't. Oh,
I can't.
his mum.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is
Not
it Anne?
sorry, listeners. We'll yeah, this isn't really relevant to my bit at all. So we have the Revolutionary Wars starting in 1792, and the reaction from the rest of Europe, which also starts in 1792 as anti-French coalition. So all the great powers join in. This includes Russia, Austria, Britain, and
Spain.
Spain. Is Spain in the first one?
I think it is at some point, but I'm not sure if it is straight away.
I think it is.
I mean, in purely military terms, France is completely surrounded. This is like Germany in '44 that we're talking about here.
Absolutely. This idea of the whole of Europe to turning up to stop our revolution plays straight into the into French hands in terms of publicity, because in 1793, August of 1793, a decree called the Levée en masse is proclaimed. Can we use that?
Go with it.
Yeah, let's go with it. Power through it. Essentially, this calls up every man between the ages of 18 and 25 to fight in the army. In one fell swoop, they recruited over 300,000 soldiers. Yeah, I mean, that's fairly big nowadays. It was unprecedented then. Let's not go over the top. We couldn't guarantee that all the aforementioned 300,000 soldiers would have a musket, weapons, or shoes.
I mean, the largest army up to this point, I mean, after Roman times, you're looking at probably 70,000 men at most.
Yeah, and yeah, like I said, raised in one fell swoop, ready to be deployed into the current theatres of operation, and which is I mean, I've got a list of a couple of battles here. So we got Jamep in November 1792, Votigny in October 1793. This is all. This is the Rhineland and southern Belgium.
Right. Yeah.
It is worked out very quickly, and this is where I want to loop back to how I began with the development of the idea of columns and the use of all arms warfare is by a mixture of pragmatic necessity and the melting pot of thinking and ideas and development that had taken place in France before 1789. It's worked out very quickly that the best way to use these very large but not particularly well trained and somewhat in some cases rather unwieldy, the best way to use them on the battlefield is in columns. Basically, in large columns that can smash through, that can break and push through lines. Just the idea doesn't always work. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Barney, you'll be taking over from me in a sec, so you can run. But so I think it's a very interesting case of an idea that was developed by a rational military theory, whether we're talking about Sachs or Guibert, before the French Revolution, being applied by French officers on the ground thinking, right, how do we get these guys to all go in the same direction and not really have to train them for months in the foot drills, maneuvers, bugle calls, and all the other necessary things that it was necessary to train a soldier to do and to listen for and to look out for.
Or even firing with live ammunition.
Yeah, exactly. We can just tell them to run that way with a bayonet. And how it's kind of recycled for the circumstances in which they found which they found themselves, in which they were and the types of operations they were fighting. But I'm gonna stop there because I'm edging into your territory. So Barnstable, take us to somewhere nasty during the French Revolutionary Wars and mention the
Oh yes. Okay, so we're going to go away from southern Belgium and western Germany, and we're going to travel down Europe, and we're going to travel to northern Italy instead. Across the Alps and go to northern Italy, where Napoleon is named commander-in-chief of the French army of Italy in 1796, basically to get him out of Paris because he's proving a bit too popular for the politicians' taste, although that's a different story that we don't really need to go into. The point is, at this point in the war, Italy is a backwater. It's a secondary theatre.
But it's part of Austria, right? So
Northern Italy is part of Austria at this point, but the main theatre of war is, as you've said, it's southern Belgium, it's western Germany. All of the politicians that have political power in the 1790s fight in Belgium and in western Germany. Either they're already politically powerful and they become army commanders, or they win victories there, which gives them political power in Paris. The basic point is nothing's going on in Italy. It's an absolute backwater. The French army is very tiny. It's not well supplied. Neither is the Austrian one.
It's a really boring campaign on Napoleon Total War, that one.
Yeah, well, exactly. If you play Napoleon Total War, you'll know exactly what we're talking about here. So Napoleon takes over, and as you might expect, he starts winning battles, and he knocks out the kingdom of Piedmont, Sardinia, which is basically around Turin and kind of northwestern Italy. He knocks them out, and then he progresses on, and by June 1796, he besieges the fortress of Mantua, which is sort of in the center of northern Italy. If you take Mantua, the road to Venice and Verona and then up into Austria is open, basically. Okay. So this is a really key fortress to take. By this point, he's been reinforced. His entire besieging army is around 50,000 men with hundreds of artillery pieces. But bear in mind, this is not only to besiege the fort, it's also to defend against any Austrian attempts to relieve. Okay. And when I say fortress, I mean it's huge. This is kind of like, this is the Death Star of European fortifications. It is known as the biggest, most powerful fort probably in Europe at this point. To call it a fort even is a bit of a, it suggests something tiny when it's not. It's huge.
And he had an army of 50,000 men.
About 50,000, about 50,000 in total. So the Austrian general called von Wurmser, he's in command. He splits his army into 4 separate columns to try and relieve Mantua. And Napoleon defeats one of these columns. It's too far away from the others for them to be supporting. He defeats one of these at the Battle of Lonato on the 3rd of August, 1796. So Wurmser concentrates the rest of his men. He concentrates these 3 columns at a town called Castiglione. And he has about 20,000 men here. And Napoleon's plan is Napoleon slightly outnumbers von Wurmser in total. Now, Napoleon's plan is to fix von Wurmser with a frontal assault. So by fix, that means that the Austrian army is engaged in battle, so they can't actually maneuver their troops.
Yeah.
And whilst he's doing that, a column of about 5,000 men that he's sent off separately a few days before is going to arrive in the Austrian rear on the Austrian flank, and then they're going to crush them together. So this is the first, David Chandler makes this point, this is the first battle where the kind of the classic Napoleonic battle tactic is attempted. So you fix your enemy in position with a frontal assault, and then you use whatever troops you have left over in order to smash into their flank or their rear. He does this at Austerlitz, he does this at Friedland, he does it at Bautzen, he attempts to do it at Waterloo, but it doesn't go. It doesn't go to plan. And this is, so this is the classic Napoleonic battle tactic, and this is the first time it's tried. Even though we're talking about fixing someone with a frontal assault and then attacking them in the rear or the flank with a secondary force, this doesn't mean that you have to outnumber your opponent. Napoleon, certainly in his early battles, is pretty much always outnumbered. It's how you use the troops, how you use the terrain. I know you were talking about Gibert. Another sort of military thinker that Napoleon was a huge fan of was, of course, Frederick the Great. And Frederick the Great was very famous for a military tactic he developed called the oblique order or the oblique assault. Classic example of this is the Battle of Leuthen in 1757. And it's basically you sort of split your army into thirds, and one third fixes the entirety of the other army, whether it be through an attack or a demonstration or whatever it is. Then you maneuver 2/3 of your army. So it's attacking basically at an angle into the flank of the enemy's army. Because because all that matters really when it comes down to it is not how many men are on the field, but how many men are engaged at the point of contact.
And how much firepower and that you can concentrate.
Precisely. Precisely. So that is really all that matters. So anyway, this is Napoleon's plan. So he advances with his main force, fixes the Austrian infantry in position. They can't move, they're engaged in a firefight. What he also does, and this is a tactical innovation, a more broad tactical innovation we can talk about, is he pushes up horse artillery. Now, if you sat at home thinking, well, all artillery is pulled by horses, what the hell is horse artillery?
I didn't know fire horses.
Well, yeah, weird, isn't it? Yeah. But
sorry.
But what it basically means is this is light artillery. As we talked about initially, when cannons are developed in medieval Europe, they'll fire something as small as a 1 pound ball, basically a tennis ball. It's not going all the way back to that, but this is inventing cannon that are light and mobile enough that that a team of 6 horses at a gallop can take it into position, and then you can quickly unlimber it. So, take the horses, unattach cannon from detach the cannon from the horses, and you're going straight into battle with it. So it's very, very mobile. It's probably better to think of it as mobile artillery rather than horse. So he moves his mobile artillery right up the front line to fire into the Austrian ranks. I can't remember exactly when they are invented, but at this point it's going to be firing something like canister or grape shot. Yeah, which again, if you've played Napoleon Total War, you will know is kind of like a cotton bag full of musket balls. So it basically turns your cannon into a giant shot, is the best way to think about it.
I just want to qualify for a second that we don't reference all these episodes from war games, everybody.
No, absolutely. It's just
70 or 80% of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Not that we're sponsored. So that obviously that's only really useful at a shorter range. So you can't fire that all the time. But this is
short.
Oh, absolutely devastating. And not just in this time period, up until the invention of the machine gun pretty much makes it redundant. So really up until the 1870s, 1880s in European warfare, European Atlantic warfare, we'd call conventional.
And the concept doesn't go away necessarily, does it? Because you got shrapnel shells, which are just shells that are full of ball bearings.
Yeah, absolutely. The concept stays 100%. Yeah. You could even see the machine gun in some ways being trying
Absolutely.
to replicate it. So yeah, anyway, Napoleon has fixed the Austrian army in position. His flanking column is making its way forward. The problem is von Wurmser notices the column, and he is able to disengage just in time before the jaws of the trap snap shut.
Yeah.
He's just able to disengage his army. So he loses about 3,000 men. The French lose about 1,500. Now, in and of itself, this is not a strategically decisive battle. Obviously, the Austrian attempt to relieve Mantua is defeated. There are more attempts to relieve Mantua, which are also defeated, and then Mantua does eventually fall. I think probably in around, I think it's January of 1797.
They just starve it out.
Basically, yeah, basically they starve it out. And then Napoleon pushes his troops on into, they're very nearly at the border of Austria proper by the time treaty is finally signed in October 1797.
That's ultimately what he's doing there, isn't it? And he's trying to attack Italy, not Italy, sorry, trying to threaten Austria from the south through the.
Oh yeah, kind of like no laughing at the back, but going in through the back door. Basically, that's the. And in fact, he does this again in 1800 when he returns to Europe, having been in Egypt, and he seizes power in a coup in winter 1799. So in summer 1800, he leads another army to Italy to fight the Austrians, which he only very narrowly wins, Battle of Marengo, very nearly loses that, and is, that changes the course of European history if he loses that battle, far more than Waterloo.
Yes.
And then he uses it as a decoy in 1805. The Austrians are expecting him to do exactly the same, and they've concentrated their best troops and their best commander in northern Italy, and he leaves a small army there to hold the fort, basically, and directs the vast majority of his troops into southern Germany, and he's captured the main Austrian army at Ulm, and he's entered Vienna within about 3 months of starting. So he, in fact, in a strategic sense, he uses the fact that he's been there before to basically trick the Austrians when in subsequent campaigns as to what he's going to do.
Yeah.
So that's basically Napoleon. Napoleon's big innovation at this point is, as I say, this kind of like fixed assault and then the flank attack. I'm not sure how much we want to get into it because maybe it's more of a Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah, let's leave that there. But
in terms of like columns and things like that, I feel like that's more Napoleonic subject.
But just for the sake of this, because we both, I think it's just interesting to highlight again that the Napoleon is also borrowing ideas and concepts and using them that have been around for a while at this point.
Oh yeah, I mean it's worth pointing out this is a man who's never commanded an army before in battle. The most he's commanded in battle is a battery of artillery, so a couple of hundred men. He's also, I mean, in 1796 he's 27 years old. He's not an old man at all, and he's not experienced whatsoever in commanding armies of this size. So it really is. The fact that he is okay, he's not tactically. The fact that he isn't tactically innovative should come as no surprise in that respect. Anybody who's going into a pretty big job at 27 years old is going to lean on what's come before. There's no surprise with that. The fact that even within those parameters, he's able to come up with new tactics that vastly experienced Austrian generals cannot cope with. Really sort of shows his military genius in that respect. But so that's sort of Napoleon. That's why I've used Castiglione as the example. This is what I tend to do with the battles that I look at in our series. We're not looking at the most decisive per se, but we're looking at when these new developments
most illustrative
start. Exactly. Yeah.
No,
so on that note as well, I wanted to talk about, as I was mentioning, I wanted to talk about a general on the other side to Napoleon, on the Allied side, on the reactionary side, however you want to phrase it. And his tactics are very different to Napoleon's, and they're a mixture of the old school and the very new and very all I can think of is avant-garde. So let's go with that. Actually, in a way, it is avant-garde because hardly anybody copies him in a tactical sense. Hardly anybody repeats what this guy ever does. And as I say, he fought 63 battles and he never lost one. And this man is the Russian Field Marshal Alexander Suvorov.
I thought it might be.
Now, this is a guy, as I say, he never lost a battle. It was his life's ambition to fight Napoleon. He never managed it, sadly.
I want to build a
Um,
house, but yeah.
I know, right? So this is a guy who has been in the Russian army his entire life. He's fought in the 7 Years' War. He's fought several wars against the Ottomans. He's fought wars against the Poles. The Russians are not initially involved, as far as I remember, or they might be initially involved and then they drop out pretty quickly in the wars against France. This changes in 1798. There's the Tsar Paul, as we were talking about. It's one of the last things he does before he dies. He orders Suvorov to take a Russian army to Western Europe to fight the French. Napoleon at this point is in Egypt. He's stuck in Egypt because Nelson destroyed the French fleet at the Nile, and he can't really get out of there. So Suvorov at this point in 1799, he's 70 years old. This is he's a tough old campaigner.
Yes.
So he goes to Italy, which is where everybody's gone since Napoleon, kicked things off there in 1796. So he's in Italy. Now, in a sense, I kind of spoiled this because I've told you he fought 63 battles and he never lost one. So through the summer of 1799, he is just smashing French army after French army up and down the Italian peninsula. He wins the Battle of Cassano, he wins the Battle of the Trebia, and eventually he's pushed the French back to Genoa on the Ligurian coast.
Yep.
So very close to the French border as it is nowadays. And there's sort of a decisive battle at a place called Novi, which is about 50 miles north of Genoa. So he commands a joint Austro-Russian army of 51,000 men. And the French by this point are reduced to around 35,000. So he's very much got the numerical advantage. So before I talk about the battle itself, I want to talk about Suvorov's actual tactics, what he does, why he's so different. So what he emphasized was speed. This is a guy who emphasized mobility. If he'd been born 100 years later, he would have been a tank commander in World War II, without a shadow of a doubt. This is not a man, normally in this period, we're talking about armies that march into position and take ages to get into position and will probably draw themselves up opposite each other, go to bed and start fighting in the morning.
Sounds like Guibert would have liked it. Sounds like Guibert and Saxe would have liked him.
Yeah, well, he's very much, he's born 1729, so he's probably of Guibert's generation, definitely.
Yeah, absolutely.
Saxe sounds like he's,
he's a bit older, but
exactly.
Actually, it sounds like they're all on similar pages.
Yeah, he's talking about accurate gunfire, use of the bayonet. He's big on the bayonet. You get in there, like you say with Saxe. You fire a couple of volleys and then you get in there. One thing he did that's really, I think, quite different to how most generals acted then and even now, I think, is that he sent troops into battle in small groups. As soon as they arrived on the battlefield, he just pushed them in because his entire thesis, and it makes sense with not using gunfire so much and using the bayonet, and speed. It's all about momentum. It's all about momentum, keeping your enemy off balance, not allowing them time to reform their lines, to restructure, because warfare is as much, if not more so, psychological than it is anything to do with tactics or technology that we're talking about. So the entire idea is to keep the enemy off balance, not allow them time to regroup, to restructure. And if that means you're just sending in troops, not exactly in penny packets, but a division at a time, if you know what I mean. That's the entire purpose behind it. So at Novi, the French hold a very solid defensive position. They're on top of the hill. The town of Novi itself has a medieval wall and a ditch surrounding it. The hills are covered in vineyards, so very difficult to walk through in an organized. Precisely. And it goes kind of exactly as you'd expect. As soon as Suvorov gets there, he throws his advanced troops in, they get pushed back. The next troops come in, he throws them in, they get pushed back. This goes on all day. Eventually, There is a flanking maneuver combined with yet another frontal assault, and they break the French line. And not only do they break the French line, but the French army is actually split in two on the retreat because it's so chaotic. And only about half the army makes it back to Genoa itself. The other half has to go about almost to the French border. The casualties are very close. The Allied casualties are around 8 to 9,000. The French lose 11,000. But obviously, if you bear in mind
It's a big chunk out of the 35,000.
Precisely.
Yeah.
That's about a 1 in 3
That has just been cut
casualty
in
rate.
two. That
Yeah.
sounds like the French after that would be more or less operationally ineffective.
They are. They're stuck in Genoa. They are for about a whole year.
Half of them.
Now, yeah. Now, the interesting thing here, it doesn't really have anything to do with our conversation, but it's absolutely epic. So I'm
Just
going
hit
to
it. Do it.
yeah, I'm going to describe it. So Suvorov is all posed to launch a knockout blow in northern Italy and probably push into France as well at this point, right? But the Russians have sent a second army into Switzerland, and this army has been defeated by André Masséna, who goes on to become one of Napoleon's marshals at the Battle of at the Battle of Zurich in September 1799, quite soon after Novi. And the Allied command orders Suvorov to turn north into Switzerland to try and recover what they've lost here. So he takes his men over the Alps. This is September, mark you. So we're not talking about summer weather at this point.
No, it's getting rather damp.
Yeah, exactly. So he takes his men across the Alps into Switzerland. The only problem is because the Russian army in Switzerland has been destroyed and he's now moved away from northern Italy, French troops march into this vacuum, and suddenly Suvorov and his army are trapped. He is surrounded in the Alps in winter by the French. So what he does, being Suvorov, as I've said, he fought 63 battles, he never lost one. He fights his way out. He takes the Russian army and they fight their way over the Alps. In a way, it's more epic than Hannibal, and no one knows about it. Hannibal had no actual military opposition to what he was doing.
This guy's a rock star.
Yeah, he's 70 at this point, just to emphasize.
Richards of generals.
Yeah, exactly. He's fighting battles left, right, and center. Troops are falling over into the chasms below. The snow. And he pulls his men out, as you might imagine. He loses a lot of men, but I think it's fair to say that anyone else would have lost the entire army.
I'd have surrendered.
Yeah, that's what I mean. What I mean. Anyone else would have surrendered.
You got me.
Yeah, he gets about 2/3 of his army out, which is pretty impressive, everything considered. And sadly, it takes a lot out of him, and he dies the following year before he's ever been able to face Napoleon in battle.
Sure, it does. If anything's going to challenge your pacemaker, that's that, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So I just thought it was interesting to highlight Suvorov. He's somebody who's not very well remembered. He might be in Russia, but he's not very well remembered.
No, not in our literature.
Not in our literature. But I think, as I say, as a general, undefeated, which is something obviously Napoleon never managed. With quite sort of
ABBA made a song about it.
Yeah, they did, didn't they? With quite unique battle tactics. But it's really nice what you've said. I was just focusing on the tactical side, so I wasn't aware of this kind of intellectual heritage of what he was doing, and it's really nice to see how that has created two quite different commanders in Napoleon and in Suvorov, but you can see that they're both coming from the same sort of intellectual source and intellectual tradition.
Absolutely, and yeah, it was quite very interesting for me to read about that pedigree and the development of ideas that took place in the preceding decades. I mean, that's no reason to be surprised about it, really. I mean, Napoleon rocks up in Italy in the end of 1796, and at 27 years old, that'd be the first thing I'd do. Right, get me some books. What did Frederick do?
I mean,
how can I use this? What I've got here?
Napoleon famously idolized Frederick in 1806 when he defeats Prussia in about Saturday afternoon. And he marches into Berlin, and he and his marshals go to visit Frederick the Great's tomb. And when they're stood there, he orders all his marshals to remove their hats. And he says, if this man was still alive, we would not have won, basically. So he absolutely, in a military sense, completely idolized
Yeah,
Frederick the Great.
and
So yeah.
And there's it's anecdotal, but he read every book in print at the time. He had a little room at the top of his house in Corsica, and he just used to lock himself away in there, and he read every book in print about Frederick the Great at the time. And of course, Frederick the Great would have almost been. When did Frederick the Great die?
Just before the French Revolution, pretty much. Yeah.
About his battles. So no, fascinating, and
yeah, absolutely.
I think we've wound together a few quite good threads there, and we have to do as this is the Great General series. Obviously, Napoleon's going to get 2 or 3 episodes, but I think Suvorov deserves, I think, a look in greater detail at some point.
Definitely.
So, but next week, I think, let's look at the Napoleonic Wars proper from 1802 onwards.
Cool.
I mean, it doesn't seem fair to just give that one episode, really. That's it. Okay.
I mean, if we're doing Great Generals, we could do an episode on Napoleon and then an episode on Wellington as well.
Yeah. Who else? Luca. Sorry, we're doing it again, people. We're planning our episodes.
I mean that's sort of the interesting thing. Not to spoil next week's episode, but obviously the whole Allied plan by the time they eventually defeat Napoleon is we haven't got anybody who's as good as him one-on-one. So we're not gonna
operationally,
so we're not gonna fight one-on-one. So that's the so eventually they work that out. I mean, you could say the Archduke Charles. He's the first one to defeat Napoleon.
I mean, but like the fact that the French are, even before the rise of Napoleon to the premiership in whatever form, whether it's consul or first consul or emperor, the French don't win all the time, but they win enough of the time that that all the heads of state in Europe think, okay, shall we maybe put aside the balance of power politics for a bit and try and work together, kind of thing.
Yeah,
and we have to look to the side all our dynastic quarrels and and worries and think, right, we really
exactly
about this.
And if you look at it sort of from the other side, you know, sort of mainstream history sees it very much through a sort of Tolstoyan War and Peace prism, in that 1812 is the great decisive moment, and before that Napoleon is never defeated, and after that, you know, he falls off his throne like that. It's not true. True. He raises an army pretty much as big as the one he took into Russia within about 4 months of coming back. It's astonishing. All right, it's not, the quality is not quite the same, obviously, but he's still got lots of allies, especially in Germany. And it's not until the summer of 1813, a good 6-8 months after he stumbles out of Russia, that the balance of power tilts against him in Europe.
Like you've got, it's that's. I mean, we'll try and end here because we're fast forwarding. But like, he does some of his best generaling in those final battles. Like and some of them were absolutely huge. Like Waterloo is obviously, as you and I as Englishmen, is one that we're taught about all the time. The Battle of the Nations, or the Battle of Leipzig in September 1813, there's 300,000 soldiers fighting that.
Yeah.
Big by World War II standards.
Oh, absolutely. And to the Battle of Borodino in 1812. Pretty much the bloodiest day in European history up to that point. There is a letter from one of the Russian staff officers describing Borodino, and he said, before you even get into the idea of, you know, the actual fighting itself, the actual noise was that loud that when he was crossing the battlefield on his horse delivering messages, if he did it with his mouth shut, his eardrums burst. The noise was that intense, just from the cannon and the musketry. I mean, we're talking about, it's quite astonishing for us to try and get our heads around, really.
But anyway, I know me and you, Barney, we could talk about this for the next 2 hours.
Yes, that's true.
Let's ring off here, and
Mm-hmm.
and we'll save that, for next week. Oh, this is going to be fun.
So we'll do Napoleon next week, and then maybe Wellington the week after that,
Yep.
and then maybe look at some other Napoleonic generals as well.
Yeah, like as I think we've noted, as I think we've hinted at in this episode, there's a few to go at.
There's a few, definitely.
One or two.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, people, thank you ever so much for tuning in and listening to our spiels.
Indeed.
And we will see you all next week. I've been Harry, and Barney's been Barney.
Indeed.
I'm sorry about that. And we will see you all next week. Goodbye.
See you later.